All right, so if you feel like your solos are boring or you feel like you've plateaued as a player, there's a pretty solid chance that you don't actually need to learn more scales and more notes. There's over 50 years worth of records that show that the 5 notes of the pentatonic scale are pretty good for 80 to 90% of the songs out there. But the question is, how is that possible? It all has to do with phrasing. So let's talk about language. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Music at its core is a language. It is used to transmit information from one person to another. And when we learn someone else's songs or someone else's solos, what we're essentially doing is we're learning how to read someone else's book out loud to our friends. When we learn to improvise our own personal solos, we are going from reading that book to having an actual conversation. So let's talk about where we learned to talk. When we were all babies, a big part of our development was babbling. And what a baby does is it babbles because it wants to mimic the sounds that it hears other people in their household making. So a baby tries to have conversations, it tries to speak and form sentences, and it can't quite do it yet, but eventually, lo and behold, we get a word. And then we get a few words, and then those few words turn into phrases or crude sentences. Eventually, as kids, we get to the point where we can, say things and get our point across, and sometimes we might use incorrect grammar, or sometimes we might use words that we think mean something, but they mean something else, and yada, yada, yada. Again, this is what it's like to learn how to solo. So continuing with that analogy, we all know someone who knows a lot of words and knows how to talk, and yet all they do is they seem to just keep going with these long run-on sentences that just don't really go anywhere. It's just word vomit, and it kind of doesn't really have a point after a while. It just feels like noise. Then I'm sure we all know people who can get their point across fairly clearly with just a few words. When it comes to soloing, I would recommend trying to be the latter. So this is what it all comes down to. Instead of trying to expand your musical vocabulary, it might be better for you to try and take the vocabulary that you have and learn how to use it correctly. Like I said earlier, this is where phrasing comes in. While soloing, phrasing is your ability to create passages or segments that work as a cohesive idea and allow you to progress the story of your solo or the arc or progression of your solo. And I would be willing to bet that for most of you, what you need more in your phrases is simplicity. So here's some exercises to help with that. So this is something I do with all of my students whenever they're first starting to learn how to solo. I have them try to solo using only one note. It requires us to focus on phrasing almost immediately. When we limit our musical vocabulary down to just one note, we start to really have to make that one note matter. In essence, we're going through every possible way that we can think of to make one note interesting. Reducing your solos down to one note forces you to think in phrases and often to think of rhythms more than anything else because you have to make one note interesting. And the only way to really do that is to focus on rhythms. Once you feel like you've exhausted all the possible options when it comes to rhythms and phrasing of one note, add another note. Then add a third. Once you feel stuck and like you've exhausted all those options with all 3 notes, that's when you record yourself doing a solo with 3 notes, and then you kind of single out specific rhythms that you've used that were interesting to you and start trying to apply them with more notes. The next method has to do with actual phrases. You see, back when people really started to make improvisation a significant part of popular music, which we all would know as the beginning of the jazz and blues era, you see the vast majority of players who were taking these solos in these early days of jazz and blues were horn players. And these guys were masters of phrasing. The reason? They had to breathe. See, they had to have phrases because they were physically incapable of having those run-on sentences like we talked about earlier. So what I recommend to you is to take a solo, and while you take that solo, inhale and exhale air in a steady stream through your phrases. You'll start to find where you need to pause and take a quick breath, or maybe where you need to leave a bigger hole so you can catch your breath. Every single note that you play is just as important as the spaces between them. Do this, and soon your soloing will feel as easy as breathing. The last exercise that I have for you is one that I'm pretty sure I've heard every single guitar-based YouTube content creator talking about, and that is having an arc to your solos. See, if you start your solo like this, there's a pretty solid chance that as a listener, you'll want that energy level to stay through the whole solo. And unless you're Shreddy McGee and can keep that energy up for days and days and days, there's a pretty solid chance that that's just way too much to start out with, and you really won't be able to finish strong, and you'll leave your audience feeling disappointed by your solo. So everyone talks about how your solo needs to have an arc to it. It needs to start smaller and build up to something so that it has that tension and release that we need to really provide something that takes the listener on a journey. This can look like starting quiet and then getting louder and louder and louder and louder as the solo progresses. This can also look like starting lower on the fretboard and eventually working your way up higher. Now, when we talk about phrasing, it means that at the beginning of your solo, your phrases are simpler, maybe just a few notes at a time, and leaving nice big open spaces that you can drive an 18-wheeler through so that the listener really is waiting for that next phrase and is eager to hear what you have to quote-unquote say. Then as the solo progresses, you can say more and more, you can work more and more, and that's where you finally need all of that vocabulary that you might already have or that you eventually want to learn. That's where you can get into more complex rhythms or more complex note choices, and you can step outside of that pentatonic and grab those outliers. In this example, I'm going to attempt to do all those things, and we'll see if it actually works. Now, as a listener, this is way more interesting to me. As a player, it helps give me the confidence to feel like I know where I'm going and not feel like I'm wandering through some wasteland of a chord progression, desperately trying to fit every single one of Eddie Van Halen's solos into one 60-second solo so that I can prove that I spent the last 30 years learning them. Ultimately, to me, it goes back to that Bruce Lee quote. I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks, but the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. See, if we have truly mastered the pentatonic scale, then we should be able to create a beautiful solo using just those 5 notes that we've practiced over and over and over again. It makes me think of B.B. King's live performance in 1993 of The Thrill Is Gone. You can find it on YouTube, but his first solo after the first verse is one of the simplest solos you will ever hear. It's not flashy, it's not crazy, but it is perfect because he says everything he needs to and nothing more. So stop babbling like a baby and try being an adult for a change. As usual, let me know down in the comments what you think. If you have tips and tricks that have helped you learn how to phrase your solos better, please drop them down below as well, because I'd love to learn and so would everybody else watching. Thank you guys so much for being a part of the channel, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Mac Wright. Please go make someone else's day better, and we will see you around.